Jack Ruby is one of the most infamous names in history. Remember, this is the man who, live on television, killed Lee Harvey Oswald just days after the assassination of President Kennedy. But who was Ruby? A Mafia hitman or a deluded loser? Let's assess the evidence here on Things Visible and Invisible. Danny Fingeroth was an award-winning writer and editor at Marvel Comics. He is a highly regarded pop culture critic and historian, the author of many acclaimed books looking at the significance of comics and the graphic novel. But he is also the author of a book about a modern American enigma, namely Jack Ruby. And he joins me down the line from his home in New York City. Danny, welcome to Things Visible and Invisible.
Well, thank you for inviting me.
Jack Ruby is a figure which is known to many. His name resonates when we talk about Lee Harvey Oswald and we talk about the President Kennedy and the assassination, the events of Dallas 1963. However, Danny, I would say that most people, be they in the United States or the United Kingdom or anywhere else in the world, would be hard-pressed to pick out Jack Ruby in an ID parade.
Well, that was part of Jack's MO, his modus operandi, if I've got the correct pronunciation. He certainly wanted people to know who he was, and he had a dream of being a star in a way, but he also liked being able to fade into the background when necessary, and not be noticed, and work behind the scenes. You know, he's the forgotten person in the Kennedy assassination. I think everybody, or almost everybody, knows that famous photo of Ruby shooting Oswald. And to go back to what you had said about picking him out in a lineup, the most famous photo of this guy, and he's got his back to the camera. So he just looks like he could be any anonymous, slightly overweight guy in a dark suit, you know, but I think that's part of it. And maybe that's symbolic of how he's been treated by history also.
Well, in a way, that's the nub of the issue here, Danny, because you're absolutely right. I've read articles, I'm sure you've read the same articles, where they said that this was his big moment and he didn't even know to look at the camera. Do you know that idea, that he had his back to the camera? But in a way, that absolutely sums up the enigma, which is Jack Ruby. That of Oswald, we know an awful lot. Obviously, Kennedy, we know even more. But Ruby, most people sort of scratch their head. And there's two schools of thought, and we'll get into this in greater detail, Danny, but there's two schools of thought which you know well. One, that he was a kind of mastermind, Mafia hitman, with all the right connections and CIA, Mafia links, etc. The other hypothesis is that he was delusional, a loner, probably psychotic in some ways, and it was a completely random killing. Is that a fair summary of the two sides of Jack Ruby that most people are thinking about?
I think so. You know, I mean, each of those points of view has a lot of sub-paragraphs and bullet points, if you pardon the expression, and you know, and subtlety and minutia. And I don't even think they're mutually exclusive. You know, I think they, as we get into more depth, I think the thing about Ruby and Oswald is not whether they were crazy. They were both out of their minds, with long histories of mental illness, well documented by various institutions and doctors. The question is, of course, were they lone nuts? That's the, you know, but they certainly were both had just lengthy histories. Well, you know, as well as family histories of insanity, you know, beyond just, you know, being neurotic or high strung, but really crazy. So, you know, Ruby, you know, Ruby himself gave half a dozen reasons for why he did it, you know, and but he does get sort of a short shrift from history. He's just this kind of dramatic figure who literally walks onto the screen, um, takes his famous shot, and then kind of disappears. Which makes him a great fodder for conspiracy theories too. When a guy's like that, but he complicates the story, right?
Well,
I mean, more than almost anybody, he changed history.
yeah.
The first, I believe, it's the first, live murder recorded on a TV camera and all that stuff. And yet, for many reasons, he's inconvenient to talk about, except as a Deus ex machina kind of figure who comes in, you know, bang, and then he's gone. But really, he stuck around for more than 3 years, and not, Oswald. Nobody really, he never really gave any lengthy interviews publicly, and of course, one of the things that people find suspicious, which, in 1963, I was not from a wealthy family, but we had a tape recorder. A lot of people I knew had tape recorders. You know who didn't have a tape recorder that was working? The Dallas Police Department. you know. Um, and I'm not even saying that I necessarily believe there was, quote unquote conspiracy. But when you look at facts like that, you go, well, that certainly seems to needlessly complicate things. Jack Ruby, on the other hand, lived for more than 3 years and wouldn't shut up.
Well, we're gonna get into that, Danny. But before we do, I think we need to paint a picture of who Jack Ruby was, because he certainly wasn't a sort of Dallas native. He had a history before he arrived on the streets of Dallas. So let's start at the beginning. Where was he born, and where did he grow up?
He was born and raised in Chicago, um, in what's called the Maxwell Street area, which it doesn't exist anymore. If you've seen the Blues Brothers movie, and you've seen the scene with John Lee Hooker playing in front of like a ghetto shopping area, that was a black ghetto in the 70s when they shot that. And then before that, it was a Jewish ghetto. And Ruby was from um, this kind of classic neighborhood that gave birth to a lot of mobsters and ne'er-do-wells, but also to Supreme Court justices and media pioneers. Same. Jack Ruby grew up in the same neighborhood as Arthur Goldberg, the Supreme Court justice, William S. Paley, who founded CBS, and also a plethora of low-level Chicago mobsters, gangsters, and people who palled around with Al Capone in the heyday of the Chicago mob. And Ruby's best friend growing up was a kid named Barney Ross, who grew up to become one of the most famous boxers in the world. He was a champion, light middleweight champion, and so it's a very American story. It's a very Jewish story. These children of Eastern European, first generation American born children of Eastern European Jewish immigrants. And Ruby came from that background. Probably, mobsters don't give out membership cards, but it's highly likely that he was at least mob affiliated. He was a loose cannon. He used to, he and Barney Ross and other people would spend time leading up to World War II, breaking up Nazi Bund meetings in Chicago. So he was a very violent guy, a very unstable guy, and yet, I found him to be sort of sleazy, but he did seem to have a lot of people who were loyal to him and liked him, and he to them. It was a very interesting guy. But that was, more, that was his background. Living in Chicago, then he moved to Dallas.
Well, just before we go to Dallas, Danny, just on the Chicago background, I mean, you've sort of painted the picture wonderfully there of people, presumably who through education went on to do some very wonderful work, and then other people that sort of drifted off towards the mob, organized crime, etc. Was Ruby's path in that way? Was it dictated by his education, or his lack of education, or his lack of application in terms of schooling? What do you think were the defining factors that meant that he went that way, whereas other people went into law or went into entertainment or other well-worn paths in that community?
Yeah, he was one of 8 children, and they all, it seemed to be a very, neurotic and enmeshed family. His mother was out and out crazy. She was institutionalized numerous times. His father was a carpenter, but also an alcoholic, and pretty much it could be a mean drunk. Um, and so I don't think Ruby had, and Ruby himself, I think he was maybe what you would call average intelligence. He wasn't winning any prizes, even if he could find a quiet place to do his homework in a house in a chaotic household like that. He was not. He was smart enough to survive and to get by with his fists and his wits, but he left school at I don't even think he made it through 8th grade. That was not his interest. His interest was sort of in action and sensation, and he would buy firecrackers and sell them to other kids. He was constantly getting in fights. I think he had to help support. He was I think he was in the middle, but it was the job of all the kids, especially the boys, to help support the family and and in effect parent his younger siblings because his parents were out to lunch.
Right.
So I don't think it was neither by inclination nor opportunity was he going to go into law or medicine or I think he was a hustler and violent. He always had a violent temper and was good with his fists. Would often come home with blood on his clothes from having been in fights. His nickname was Sparky, and one of the supposed origins of it was because he had you could spark him to anger and spark him to violence. So that was sort of his background.
I mean, I don't want to jump too far ahead straight away, but I mean, is that one of the things that your research has borne out? This sort of impetuousness that people talked about, this sort of compulsiveness almost about doing things of the moment. Was that a sort of feature of his character from early on?
That seemed to be emblematic of him. That people, you had to kind of walk on eggshells around him. Um, and he might just as easily use that violence on a friend's behalf. But he was very quick, especially in a city like Chicago. He was born in 1911, so in the 20s and 30s in Chicago. I think there were like in a lot of cities, like in New York, there would be ethnic territories, and don't go into that, cross that street or into that neighborhood. And I think there was a lot of that, and it was channeled often into boxing. That's why, because Ruby actually, if you ever see footage of him, or even just the footage of him shooting Oswald, he moves in a very graceful manner. The person that reminds me of, oddly, or maybe not so oddly, is Jackie Gleason on the Honeymooners show. If you've ever seen that,
Yeah.
sort of Gleason was a heavy guy, but he moved gracefully. Ruby, having been trained as a boxer, moved much more gracefully than you would imagine he would.
So, relatively unhappy childhood in Chicago, not really going anywhere. Was it a case of drifting to Dallas, or did he go there with a particular aim in sight?
Well, he'd done some drifting, sort of in a classic, almost it's almost like a movie, a classic Depression era figure. He'd been out to the West Coast and tried to make a living there, delivering newspapers and as a waiter and who knows what else, but that nothing ever took. He also would often follow his siblings around. His sister was in the nightclub business and he would follow her. So she had been in the nightclub business. She had been running a club or a couple of clubs in Dallas. And Ruby went down there, according to some sources, his brothers sent him down to help her out because she wasn't doing well. There are others who say that he was sort of the leading edge of the Chicago mob, their incursion into Dallas. Dallas was there was a lot of crime in Dallas, but it wasn't organized. It was so I think the mob, supposedly the Dallas mob, saw an opportunity and they sent Jack there. Again, these stories are not mutually exclusive because he did go down there and did take over some of his sister's clubs. He had one. She had one kind of Asian themed nightclub. I may be mixing up a couple of, but he transformed her nightclub into a country western club, and through that he worked. Some of your older viewers may know the name Tennessee Ernie Ford, and I'm sure they've heard of Hank Williams. Jack Ruby was the last, probably the last person to give Hank Williams regular work.
Amazing.
That was one of the things that when I started thinking, researching about Ruby, because I was a kid when the assassination happened, and Ruby was just one of many historical figures. But when you see how many people how many well-known people came across Ruby's path and interacted with him and had an opinion about him, because everybody knows, or most people know, he owned a strip club, and that was the main thing he was doing when he killed Oswald. But he had been in and out of all sorts of show business ventures and knew mobsters, knew movie stars, knew all, people. He hobnobbed with like the low-life degenerates who hung around downtown Dallas. He also hobnobbed with like the doctors and lawyers that he met at his synagogue, And for some reason, I guess he almost made himself indispensable. It just somehow everybody knew this guy.
But in some ways, Danny, the picture you're painting is of a classic type. You've met them, I've met them. They're fringe figures, but they kind of ingratiate themselves into whatever world they're in to the point where they become useful. I mean, is that a sort of shorthand summation of where Jack Ruby is in those early years in Dallas?
Yeah, I think his early years in Dallas, I think he found, a niche for himself in in the criminal and just in the kind of oddball entertainment subcultures of Dallas. Dallas had, and there was a lot of overlap between these worlds, especially in downtown Dallas. I refer to him as kind of the unofficial or the self-appointed mayor of downtown Dallas. Where, he had these sleazy clubs, and yet, and there were others. It was a thing that I think that immigrant families would do. You open up a club because there were nearby clubs also operated by children of Jewish immigrants. The Weinstein brothers, in particular, who thought Jack was a creep, and yet they had to deal with him because he was always there. And yet, across the street from these clubs was the Adolphus Hotel, where celebrities and politicians would stay when they came to Dallas. It was all, and then a lot of college students would come to the strip. I think strip clubs then were more like burlesque. I mean, they were, I don't know, you wouldn't call them innocent, but they were not as blatant as clubs now. And Jack went out of his way to be friendly with and bring food to the Dallas police. And of course, there were those who say he brought them, that he bribed them. There were those who say he was involved in drug dealing with them. There's a million rumors and suppositions, and they're very hard to parse out because very often testimony about them might come from somebody who, if somebody is serving 20 years in prison in Dallas, and they're talking to the Warren Commission and they tell you all about Jack Ruby's criminal associations, what's that person's motivation? It's very, I'd say the problem or the challenge with researching anything about the Kennedy assassination is not a lack of information, is that there's so much.
Absolutely.
Jack did not talk about, on the record, did not talk about politics a lot. I think he would speak to friends, customers at his clubs, people he'd meet as he circulated in the many other venues in Dallas. I think he was, given his background, kind of a middle of the road Democrat. Certainly, reportedly he wept when President Roosevelt died. I think he tried to keep apolitical. He identified Jewish very much. He was very concerned about his Jewish background and anti-Semitism, and how Jews were regarded in America and in Dallas in particular. As I said, during the years leading up to World War II, he would literally go and bust up Nazi Bund meetings with other guys in Chicago. So I think that was more his interest than politics. From what I can see, he admired President Kennedy. I think he felt um, some kinship since Kennedy was the first Catholic president elected. I think he felt that sort of as fellow members of religious minority groups, that Ruby felt some connection to him, and I think like a lot of people in the country, sort of enjoyed watching Jackie Kennedy and the Kennedy family grow. There was there was sort of a feeling that it was a new era and a new generation, and I think Ruby was not immune to that. I think he took some interest and pleasure in that.
In terms of the Jewish community in Dallas at the time, I mean, how extensive was it? And was he very much a part of that? For example, did he attend a local synagogue?
Well, he Dallas was an interesting town, and it was sort of an interesting hybrid in those days. I don't know. I'm not so sure about currently, but it was a hybrid between a progressive northern city and a segregated southern city. It had elements of both. And interestingly, when a lot of American cities were having race riots in the early '60s, Dallas did not, because it's the people, what they call the Dallas City, I forget the council, I forget the exact name. It was the business leaders and the political leaders. They realized that they had to um, integrate and treat black people more equitably than they were in other parts of the South then. But there was a lot of backlash as well. And sort of the Jewish community, because a lot of them were the merchants and shopkeepers of that era, got caught in the middle. If they didn't integrate enough, they would face hostility from the black community. If they integrated, what some people saw as too quickly, they'd they'd have it would screw up their relations with the white community. So Ruby was very conscious of that, and he did belong to a prominent synagogue in Dallas, where the one of the things I have in my book is I was interviewing Jack's. The movie Weekend at Bernie's?
Hmm.
If you've heard of that movie, the star of that is a guy named Jonathan Silverman. Silverman's father, Hillel Silverman, was Jack Ruby's rabbi, and he died. And he went from Dallas to L.A., and my joke used to be he went to become Buddy Hackett's rabbi, but it turns out he actually became Buddy Hackett's rabbi. So, but at that point, he was, so the guy died like 2 years ago at age 99, I think, very much with all his marbles. And when I interviewed him about 10 or 12 years ago, when I started on this project, it had started out as a graphic novel project, morphed into a prose, more standard biography. He offered me access to the notes he took visiting Jack in prison every other day for 4 months after he killed Oswald. He said, "Would you like to see my notes?" I went, "Yeah, I wouldn't mind." And so Ruby was very involved, very conscious of himself as Jewish, and felt that somehow anything good or bad, or anything good or anything bad that happened in Dallas that he was related to was somehow reflective not just of the individuals, but potentially of the Jewish community. So he was worried, and there was an outbreak of anti-Semitism in Dallas in the period leading up to Kennedy's visit. Up to and including a famous flyer that went out, that sarcastically welcomed Kennedy to Dallas, signed by someone named Bernard Weissman, who Ruby thought was like a person that didn't exist, but was given a Jewish name so that if anything bad happened, the Jews would be blamed. So this was very much Ruby's concern, which again doesn't rule out the possibility of him being employed, hired by, intimidated into doing what he did. But there's one school of thought that I used to have, was that Ruby thought he was doing public relations for the Jewish people, that he'd be the Jew that killed the guy that killed the president, and he'd be a hero, and then people would therefore that would somehow end anti-Semitism.
Well, let's look at that, Danny, because let's go to the events of
Sure.
November '63. President Kennedy's been assassinated. Lee Harvey Oswald is with the Dallas police. There's a media scrum. But Jack Ruby has other things on his mind. I mean, he didn't go to the Dallas police station that morning. He was doing other things and just happened to wander by. Do you want to give a brief summary of what he was doing that day in downtown Dallas?
Well, in the 48 hours between the Kennedy assassination and the Oswald assassination, Ruby did everything exactly the opposite that you would think a professional hired assassin would do. He made himself visible all over town and conspicuous all over town, and talking to people, offering advice, showing up on camera, getting the DA in the case, by the way, was the prosecuting DA was Henry Wade, later became more famous for Roe v. Wade. So he's like schlepping Henry Wade over to the camera to talk to the report. It's as if Ruby was working for the Dallas Chamber of Commerce and trying to make everybody feel at home. It was insane. It was, especially if you're thinking, well, if here's a guy who's been assigned to like stay undercover and then pop up out of nowhere. So he's all over town. He's saying all sorts of crazy stuff. And then a question I get a lot from people is, well, how did Ruby get in to the police headquarters to get his shot at Oswald? And from just from researching, and Ruby was ubiquitous. Anywhere there was action, there was Jack Ruby, because he wanted to be where the action was. He needed to know what everything was happening and what everybody was doing. So to me, it just seems, well, nobody would question Jack Ruby showing up there. They'd be more surprised if he wasn't there. So he allegedly, he had been home. He had a roommate who vouched for what he said and what he did. He owed some money to one of his dancers, and he didn't like to have the strippers come to his house. He didn't like the people who worked for him to know exactly where he lived, because a lot of them had violent husbands or boyfriends or were violent themselves. So he went to wire some money from Western Union, which to a young person, I don't even know what they make of it. There was a way of sending money. It was kind of like Venmo, but before the internet.
Yeah.
So you would go to the Western Union, and instead of sending a telegram, you'd send money. Anyway, he had gone to send money to one of his dancers who needed the money, and then he happened to see a block away this commotion at police headquarters, and it was Oswald being transferred a good hour or two later than they said he would be. And Ruby just goes over being curious, and then something overcomes him, and the next thing he knows, he's in a fugue state, and the next thing he knows, he shot Oswald. That's one version of the story that he told. He told others, and obviously if somebody thinks that it was a setup and that it was a conspiracy of some kind, then obviously that story doesn't hold water. But certainly he did seem to spontaneously show up there.
Yeah, I mean, there's something. This is where we get into the whole realm then of his motivation. Was he acting on behalf of other people? Was he trying to silence Oswald, etc., etc. But just moving that aside for the moment, because that will take a whole show on its own. What people forget, and you've alluded to it already in our previous discussion, Danny, is that unlike Oswald, Ruby was around for a few years prior or post the killing of Lee Harvey Oswald and President Kennedy. And it was during that time, as you've suggested, that his Rabbi Silverman, came and visited him a number of times. But what seems to have happened is that, again, and this is perhaps, given what you've told us, completely consistent, is that Jack Ruby is now very inconsistent when it comes to the version of events. And I think I'm right in saying that his version of events seem to keep chopping and changing right up until his death.
It did. His version changed, and I mean, and again, as opposed to Oswald, who we'll never know what he actually said behind closed doors. And by the way, one of those doors Jack Ruby tried to get into. We don't know why. Whether he was just being nosy or was even then on a mission to try to kill Oswald. But yeah, Ruby was accessible. He was in a prison, but it was, if somebody really wanted to get to him, they could have gotten to him. And then he would hold impromptu news conferences during the recesses in his trial. And the rooms were filled with reporters and spectators. If somebody had seriously wanted to get in and silence Jack Ruby, it would have been pretty easy.
But in some ways, is this sort of also fitting into this idea of somebody who, you've explained his various endeavors in Dallas, which were sort of low-level show business, if we can put it like that. He was on the lowest rung of what could pass as show business. Was this a man who finally had an audience, a man who finally had somebody who was going to listen to him? It was suddenly the Jack Ruby show at these sort of press conferences?
I think that's probably part of it, because he just he loved the spotlight. Even at his clubs, he would very often act as his own MC and his own bouncer. So he definitely is a part of him that wanted to be a stand-up comedian, that liked the limelight. At one point, he had been running a country western club that had been started by a guy named Bob Wills, who was, of course, the king of country music. And Ruby was one of the first people. I'm not saying he was a great humanitarian, but he was one of the first people to actually host integrated concerts in Dallas. And he would come out dressed in a white cowboy outfit with fringes and a cowboy hat and fake six-shooters. I hope they were fake, and call himself the Chicago Cowboy. So he was a big show-off, and he loved being the center of attention, but he didn't really have any discernible show business type talent that he could exploit.
Now, some of the press that were at those various conferences, impromptu conferences that Jack Ruby was holding, one of them was Dorothy Kilgallen, and there's been a lot of speculation. She was of the view that Jack Ruby held the key to the Kennedy assassination. What's your view on that, Danny?
It's funny. My memory, like many people of my generation, of Dorothy Kilgallen is one of the panelists on What's My Line. She was a serious journalist, but prone, I think, to sensationalism. And like many people involved with the Kennedy assassination, she had a quote unquote mysterious death. And she claimed that she had an exclusive interview with Jack Ruby where he told her things that he didn't tell anybody else that would blow the case open. There have been books written about it. There's a movie in production that I think Pacino and De Niro and Barry Levinson are involved with. My personal feeling is I doubt that she got anything from him, even though he was a fan of hers. I doubt she got anything from him that he didn't say in those 3 years. And it does seem, a little odd to me that between her alleged exclusive interview with Ruby and her death, there were 2 years, a year and a half. Again, she supposedly had notes that disappeared. So it's intriguing, but I can't imagine a reporter having news like that would then hold it for her book, or why would you not at least give part of it? So I don't know. The thing that makes her story compelling is that she supposedly, look, there's a lot of deaths. A lot of people died connected to the Kennedy assassination in what can be seen as mysterious or sinister ways. I don't, there are books written about that. You could say that people in that demimonde of Dallas show business and crime, and just the marginal people involved with that were prone to living violent lives and knowing violent people. But I certainly can't discount those. What I figured out early on is that I'm not smart enough to figure out the mysteries of the Kennedy assassination, but that Jack Ruby was a fascinating guy. So in my book, I try to give voice to some of the, less out there theories, as well as to the Warren Commission, who did you may not agree with their conclusions, but they did an incredible amount of research. And I used the research as well as interviews I did myself with Ruby's niece and nephew, with the children of the other club managers, with Rabbi Silverman and his notes. I just tried to put together a picture of this important, confusing figure. But I went down a couple of rabbit holes, and I just realized, boy, I am not smart enough to know which is the true rabbit hole.
Yeah. I mean, the other thing, the elephant in the room, I guess, Danny, is, and you've alluded to it in our previous discussion, and perhaps Rabbi Silverman also in his notes, which is the psychiatric mindset of Ruby. Because even if he had sort of episodic mental health episodes or mental illness of some sort, that would color everything in terms of his ability to remember things, what he said to one person one day, what he said to another person another day. Do you think that that's something what's your conclusion on that? I mean, is this what we're dealing with, the most sort of unreliable witness we could possibly come across, simply because his mental state kept varying?
Yeah, I think he had this trial that was the biggest circus trial of all time in America until the Chicago 7 or Chicago 8 trial. I mean, the most famous lawyers in America were hired and fired by his family. Melvin Belli was the main lawyer, and at the time, he was literally the most famous lawyer in America. Um, and 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 they tried to get him off on this kind of esoteric. Obviously, it's on live TV. There's no doubt that he killed Oswald. The question is, what was his state of mind? Was he legally insane? And Melvin Belli, who was an accomplished lawyer and had actually defended murder cases, not many, but people say he never did a murder trial. He did a couple. He himself had bad history with the judge from a case involving a stripper named Candy Barr, who was mobster Mickey Cohen's girlfriend for a time, and the judge. I mean, it's an incredible story. And Ruby was not. It's funny. Ruby was not allowed to testify at his trial, but nobody stopped him from talking to reporters at length during intermission, or for having anybody come to visit him. And so, yes, he was. He had, and it was also very hard to tell whether he was. A lot of people say, well, he was pretending to be crazy, or pretending, he had delusions that he had started a second Holocaust, that Jews were being tortured in the prison, that his family members were being killed, even though none of them were harmed or really even very much threatened. So what was, if everything Jack Ruby said was some kind of act, then he should have gotten an Academy Award, because he just, said and acted in the craziest ways.
Yeah. Unfortunately, Danny, we have come to the end of our time together. This has been absolutely fascinating. However, I think the more that I listen to you, the more I've looked at what you've written, the more I hear about Jack Ruby, the enigma continues. I don't think we're anywhere near a conclusion just yet. Tell people where they can find out more about you and where they can purchase a copy of your book.
You can find me at dannyfingeroth.com. I also do a lot on Facebook. And Jack Ruby, The Many Faces of Oswald's Assassin, is published by Chicago Review Press. It's available Amazon, Barnes & Noble. Order it through your local independent bookstore. And if you're an audiobook guy and you've enjoyed listening to me here, imagine 14 hours of me reading the Ruby book into your headphones. How can you pass that up?
Indeed. Danny, for now, thank you so much for coming on Things Visible and Invisible.
Thank you for joining us on another episode of Things Visible and Invisible. We're dedicated to uncovering phenomena that challenge our understanding of reality, from ancient enigmas and paranormal encounters to scientific anomalies and forgotten histories. If you enjoyed this journey into the mysterious and unexplained, please consider subscribing to our channel and hitting the notification bell to stay updated on future explorations. Have a personal experience or story that aligns with our investigations? We'd love to hear from you. Visit our website at tvi.show and reach out through our contact form. While we can't feature every submission, we review them all, and your story might be featured in an upcoming episode. To support our continued investigations, please consider becoming a Patreon supporter or channel member. Your contributions make these explorations possible and give you access to exclusive content, early releases, and monthly behind-the-scenes discussions with our team. Don't forget to check out our merch store. We've got everything from TVI-branded t-shirts and hoodies to stickers and coffee mugs, perfect for showing your support while keeping the mysteries close. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time as we continue to explore the things visible and invisible.